So basically, before coming in here today, I had a few people who thought that this reading group was just about getting together and reading fiction stories that contained an element of BDSM, you know, something like 50 Shades of Grey, something like that. It is not that at all. Okay. So the idea of this reading group is for us to go over mainly academic texts and philosophy texts on BDSM. So BDSM is not just something that is alluded to in the texts. BDSM is the main topic of the text. It is the main element of analysis of the text. I do have an entire year's worth of scheduled texts that I can bring, but if you go on FetLife and you look for the reading group information, you'll only find information for about 6 months. And that is because I wanted to open up the space for people to suggest their own readings. So I don't want to tell you what to read. I'm making some initial suggestions. And then if people want to contribute with their own text, with their own areas of interest, I will be more than happy to oblige you all and to discuss the text that you want to bring to the table, that you want to discuss here with us. From my previous experience in running a group like this, what would happen is that, say, out of a group of 20 people, 2 at the most would have read the text before coming into the session. And what would happen is that when that happened, the discussions were very difficult to get started. They were very difficult to get somewhere because you had 2 people who knew what the topic was and you had 18 people who didn't and just went there expecting to listen without contributing back. Now, obviously, being in a reading group does not mean that you have to speak, and if you have any kind of social anxiety, etc., it's okay, it's perfectly normal and acceptable to just sit in and listen. But sitting in and listening while you've sort of done your homework, so to speak, in the background before coming in is different than just sitting in and not knowing what the text is all about, especially because then these 2 people, say, who've read the text, sort of have to make it their job to lecture everyone else about the text, otherwise there will be no discussion because no one will know what the topic is. And so that sort of creates a very uncomfortable power imbalance where that 1 or 2 people will have to lecture everyone else rather than having a common space where people get together on an equal level and just discuss ideas. So what I would like to sort of propose as a sort of a working ethics going forward is that people that want to come to these sessions, they're always welcome to come, but do try to fit in your schedule some time to at least go over the text, even if you don't have enough time to read it, and I can totally relate. Sometimes my working days are 16 hours long, so I can relate to that. But if you don't have the time to read through it, at least to go over it, so you'll have a sense of what's going to be discussed in the group. Furthermore, if at any moment someone has any issues with not understanding what I'm about to say or not understanding what I've said because, you know, my accent might not be the best, especially since I've only arrived in the country like 2 months ago and I'm Portuguese, so I'm not a native English speaker. Please say so and I'll try to rephrase it, explain it some other way. Furthermore, for me it's really important to clarify something. So I've been doing kink for about 10 years, give or take. But I am also a researcher on BDSM. So I have these 2 different approaches to kink, a more practical one and a more theoretical one. And for me, they're not really separable. What I mean by this is that the way I approach kink, and the way I approach kink in the sense of how I engage with other people and how I play with other people is actually sort of informed by the stuff that I've learned when reading about this. It's informed by the way a great many deal of thinkers and researchers and academics have looked at this. And so there isn't the academic Daniel and the play party Daniel. There's just one Daniel, which is me, with several different facets, obviously, to my personality. But I always try to integrate all of those. Another thing that I always warn people about is that I am annoyingly picky with words. And so whenever someone uses any kind of word, any kind of concept, I'll be like, are you sure that's exactly what you mean? And what about the etymological implications of the fact that that word comes from ancient Greece, yada, 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 which obviously might not be to everyone's liking, so please feel free to ignore me when I start going off on those rants. Okay, so it's sort of my disclosure. You don't have to entertain me and my rants. You can just ignore me and I'll eventually shut up. And the conversation will just go on into something else. So don't let me hijack myself or the reading group. As I've said, I have already made public the links for the first 6 months of reading. I don't know them by heart, so I'm going to go look to my notes. So next month, the text that I wanted to bring is called From SSC and RAC to the 4 Cs, Introducing a New Framework for Negotiating BDSM Participation. So the first text that we're going to work on next month is all about consent and different consent frameworks and how we have historically moved away from SSC, safe, sane, and consensual, into very different consent gathering strategies and frameworks. The next one, so this is for November. The next one is maybe one of my favorite texts on kink, and whenever someone comes up to me, and this happens a lot, whenever someone comes up to me and says, you know, I'd like to know more about kink, where should I start? And I'm already copy-pasting this link even before the person has finished typing. And it's called Towards a General Theory of BDSM and Power, and it's written by a really awesome activist back in the United States in the San Francisco community called Peppermint. I don't know if you've heard about him. He's sort of internationally famous within the scene. And if BDSM is about power, this might be one of the most accessible texts on how exactly BDSM is about power and what's the power aspect of BDSM. Then there's another text called Sex, Power, and the Politics of Identity. And I'm sure most of you have heard a term that is very much in use nowadays called identity politics. And people often, from the right wing, use identity politics as almost as an insult. But through this text, I wanted us to explore the usefulness of identities and of having labels, not to be chained down by those labels. I did a joke with chains there, but I should have done it with rope. But identities as a sort of a useful tool to then move on into more political objectives, so to speak. Afterwards, we've got another text that I really, really love called Pain as Culture, and it talks about discrimination against BDSM, and it does so in a way that I find awesome because it looks at BDSM scenes and BDSM tropes, and then looks at everyday life, and the text just asks, if we are so okay with this, then why aren't we okay with this? So just to give you a quick example, people will often say that, sadists and masochists are sick and they need to get treated and are deviants, etc., 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 because who can ever enjoy pain, that kind of stereotype. But then you walk into a gym and the first thing you hear is no pain, no gain, right? And so you're like, okay, pain, good, pain, bad, why? Basically, and the text takes you through all sorts of different everyday life scenarios. It's like, why is this good in these circumstances and bad in these other circumstances? Then we have another one called Women's Perspectives on BDSM Power Exchange, so the role of gender and the gender dynamics within BDSM. And the other one that I've got prepared is Gay Shame and BDSM Pride, and it's sort of a more historical overlook about the depth that the BDSM community has towards the gay leather community as sort of an originator of the BDSM scene for once, and at the same time the way that pride and shame sort of sometimes correlate with one another, and how BDSM pride is often sometimes an escape valve from gay shame, at least to some cohorts of gay men, and why that is so. So as you see, my objective here is to always try and bring sort of a queer, feminist, intersectional approach. Some of the other texts that I have, pending as a suggestion, also deal with gender, but not with women's perspectives, but rather with trans perspectives. So trans perspectives on BDSM and the way that BDSM can serve as a tool to explore gender roles and to be trans affirmative. And so my concern is always to try and analyze BDSM from the perspective of given minorities, and how a deeper or better understanding of BDSM will actually help us understand better our own dynamics and the difference between, say, having a cisgender straight couple in leather or having two men in leather, for instance. It's not exactly the same. It's not culturally equivalent, even though it's just two people playing out the same things. So my concern is always to be, I'm sure you've heard the expression sex positive. There's an expression that I like better than sex positive, which is sex critical. So it's to assume that sex is not necessarily good or bad in itself. What might be important or good or bad is to have a critical approach upon it, to understand the how and the power dynamics behind sex and sexuality in our culture. And so, for instance, one of the examples that I always give when I talk about being sex critical has to do with 50 Shades of Grey. Obviously, everyone here will roll their eyes at 50 Shades of Grey, and you've even had a lot of campaigns saying that 50 Shades of Grey promotes gender inequality, promotes domestic violence, partner violence, intimate violence, etc., etc. And all of those are absolutely true. But at the same time, a lot of people use 50 Shades of Grey to explore their own sexuality and to think, oh, maybe I'm also into this. So it's both good and bad at the same time. There's no deciding factor that will say that this is good and that is bad and that is good and that is bad. It depends on how things are used. And that's why you need a critical stance. You need a critical stance to understand what makes, within a certain context, something able to be used in a positive way or in a negative way, by whom, under which circumstances, etc., etc. And so my idea with this reading group is to sort of promote that kind of literacy, promote that kind of analysis, and to take seriously the playfulness of BDSM. Because we're always going on about how BDSM is a form of play, but playing is actually something very serious. We learn things by playing, especially as children. It's fundamental for children to play in order to learn. And as we grow old, we are often told to stop playing. But if playfulness and playing is actually a way of learning things, if we stop playing, we stop learning, or we stop engaging with that specific form of learning. And so now that we're here, now that we're playing with BDSM, now that we're playing with definitions of gender, sexuality, bodies, pleasure, etc., 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 then let's take that playfulness seriously, as contradictory as that might seem or sound, and engage with the seriousness of the plays that we do here. Yeah, so I would say that basically that is my pitch, that is my my idea. It's not an elevator pitch because it's been 20 minutes now. That's my idea, that's my pitch for this reading group. But my pitch is just as good as yours, if not worse. And so I wanted to hear from you, assuming that you're interested in coming here, in spreading the word and inviting your friends to come, so there can be more of us. I wanted to hear what you think about what you've just heard, what you think about the suggested group dynamics for the reading sessions, and if this sort of matches your expectations of what you were hoping to find here today or not. To break the silence, always so topical. It gets better after you've done it a few times. Yeah, sure.
So first of all, I'd like my course to be disguised, please.
Yeah.
And second, so you've talked a lot, your ideas for reading so far seem very focused on like a kind of very pure idea of BDSM as being bondage and dominant. I don't know what stands for that. But and my experience with academic works on BDSM specifically, you tend to take a fairly heuristic view of what that means. So it tends to focus on power dynamics, how you find pain measurable, as you said. But in practice, in the BDSM community, we actually have a lot of fantasies that don't strictly fall within. So there's people like pet players who are not necessarily into dominance and submission, they just like role playing as a pet. The people who are into certain materials, I wondered if you might sort of incorporate that kind of wider view of fetishism in general, rather than focusing kind of squarely on just BDSM.
Well, see, the thing is, even though I fully agree with let me split this up into two parts. So yes, number one, I do want to include stuff so that's why I've said that this is half of the list that I have ready, so there's a lot of other topics that I've left out that I have on the back burner. And obviously fetishism is understood as a whole, is one of those things for certain. And we can start this discussion off right now, because you've just given an example, pet play. And you've mentioned, people who do pet play might not want to be necessarily top or bottom in the traditional sense. But if you look at pet play not as something that people do, but something that is culturally and socially framed, what place do pets occupy in the hierarchy of power within human society? So even if the people themselves are not engaging in the traditional sense of power play, you can analyze those categories of playfulness within the wider framework of how, for instance, animals are treated in our society. And then you can just step a little bit to the side, and we can have a really interesting discussion about veganism. Starting from and ending in pet play. So that's, I don't know if my line of thinking here is being explicit enough, or if you think I just went off the deep edge.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. I mean,
I do that a lot.
Correct me if I misunderstood you. You're saying, I mean, you're kind of making a fairly common philosophical point about sex, which is that there's always a power dynamic, not in it.
Yeah.
A DSC.
Yeah.
But I mean, yes, you can analyze it like that, but there are certainly other ways to look at philosophy involved DS dynamics, and maybe applying those methods to, say, a couple who are both pet players and they don't actually dance off each other, but they both enjoy being put together in the role of pony or pony or pair of ponies or whatever.
Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the difference. I would say, if I'm understanding your comments correctly, I think that sort of speaks to the difference between psychology and sociology. So psychology would attempt to analyze exactly what those people in that situation mean or feel or are doing, and sociology would attempt to understand what are the structures, the constructs, the devices that make those practices meaningful as a whole. You know, so let's say we lived in an alternative universe where the concept of slavery had never existed. Would we have master-slave relationships? You know, that sort of thing. Let's say we lived in a society where animal use and abuse was non-existent, where there was no difference, no practical difference between humans and other forms of animality. Would there be pet play? This is obviously just theoretical, just hypothetical, but I'm just sort of trying to look at it from a more sociological and cultural analysis point of view, rather than what the people are engaging in. But even from a more psychological point of view, I would say that even if we leave aside the DS aspect of power dynamics, I would say that power is present every time you have at least two people. I don't mean power in the sense of I am topping you or you're topping me. I'm talking about power in the sense that there's always a flow of influence, rather than maybe just not using the word power and using influence might make it, you know. So, like, between us, I'm sitting up here, you're sitting down there. You waited for me to hand you your words. Do you know what I mean? There's all sorts of formats by which we negotiate power. And it's interesting because I think that what BDSM does, understood as a whole, is it gives you sort of a sandbox where you can play with that power in an explicit way, which doesn't mean that power only exists within the sandbox. I think that power is made more visible and more explicit within the sandbox, but it exists everywhere and anywhere you are. So, I don't know, I go to a bar with someone who is read as a woman, and I'll get the tab handed to me, and not to the person being read as a woman. Why? Because of gender dynamics, because of power relationships that are institutionalized, that are culturally and historically made solid. You know, and this is what I mean by power. It's all of those tiny, tiny little things. But yeah, but going back to what you said earlier, I do want to get into fetish as well as a topic, because I think it's actually very interesting. I once did I'm sorry, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I once did a small study about the way BDSM is represented in mainstream Portuguese media. And it was fascinating because you would have entire news pieces talking about BDSM and illustrating those pieces with fetishism. So fetishism would never be the focus of attention of the pieces, but would always be the illustration of those pieces. So the photos, the metaphors, etc., they would all be fetishistic in nature, but then fetishism would be totally ignored as its own thing, you know, as its own theme. It would be sort of deprecated and considered as a subsection of BDSM, something, you know, minor within BDSM, as you said. I sort of said so, or hinted at yourself. So I really do want to bring fetishism to the fore, because I think there's lots of interesting cultural analysis that you can do around and with fetishism. I don't know if that sort of reply to. I have this horrible tendency of people ask me a question, and instead of replying to the question, I will try to dismantle the question, which is very annoying for a lot of people.
I mean, we're not academics.
Yeah, well, then you get my vibe, right? You get my vibe. I don't know if you wanted to say something.
No.
Okay. So what area are you from?
Linguistics.
Oh.
So I mean, there's some elements to like power dynamics in like social linguistics and stuff like that. But that tends to be, it doesn't tend to be the kind of first thing to say. And we tend to kind of leave that off to sociology.
Yeah, well, let me get you in on a little secret. I'm coming from communication sciences.
Okay.
So we're actually more alike than we might assume. I had to have linguistics and pragmatics and logic, etc., etc. But yeah, even from a more linguistic point of view, the way language evolves, if you want to go there, the way that language evolves, both encodes and makes explicit social dynamics and social relationships of power that congeal over centuries. You know, you have words deriving from how people at the court used to speak, and you have words that derive from how the low-lives commoners used to speak, and then those get encoded as being, you know, posh or working class, etc., etc. And all of those dynamics are also power dynamics in a way, and linguistics is a very interesting field, in my opinion, to explore those things, and that's why I really, really love to go into etymology. I cannot give a class without stopping sometimes. No, let's look at the etymology of this concept, and then everyone in the class will sort of roll their eyes at me. But yeah, see, this is me going off in the deep end. I don't know who else wants to make any more suggestions, comments. Please don't throw tomatoes. Was this the kind of thing you thought you were gonna find when you saw the announcement? Were you expecting it?
Well, I had no idea what the workshop was about. I didn't read it. Workshop is now. Okay, what is it?
Well, were you pleasantly surprised by or unpleasantly surprised?
A little bit unpleasantly, but I kind of don't really want to get into that whole thing, because that's going to be another 20 minutes debate, and yeah.
We have to be out of here by 3.
We'll still have 20 minutes, so if you want.
Well, I do not like the framing of everything in terms of power dynamics, because I think that is worse than reductionist. Reductionist is good. It's super reductive. And I really do not like looking at looking at a thing always through the same angle, and that is extremely annoying, and that's before getting into the ideological biases that get into that.
Mm-hmm.
But like for example, I kind of wanted to avoid that, but I don't have a better example. I do not do any sort of thing that includes power dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay, say you have a scene of pure sensation play. That's not supposed to hurt in any sort of way. It's and you have one or several people. We are applying toys and things and textures to one or more other people also.
Mm-hmm.
There is no. Well, it is possible to reach for a point where you can actually read power dynamic into that, but not really. That's pure play. There might be some influence, yeah, because that is so remote from anything that what power means, that it really does not apply. It's sort of it would be actually incorrect to use the term or that lens to try to look at what is happening in such a situation.
Mm-hmm. Can I offer a counterpoint?
Yeah.
So, for instance, and I was just talking about this earlier with someone else, if you are in a very early stage of your life, for instance, and you don't have a lot of purchasing power, there is a lot of sensation play that you might be locked out from because you don't have enough money to buy the toys. And obviously I'm talking about very specific things, and obviously again I know there are ways to go around that, sure, but some of the very specific toys, like, so, I don't know, electric play, etc., you need to have money to buy the right set of equipment to then be able to produce or receive the right set of, the right as in the set of sensations that you want to feel or to provide to someone else. And so purchasing power is one form of power, and you can look at it and see how capitalism, for instance, influences or impacts.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I was that would go reaching very far. But okay, fair. I was thinking of specifically. Well, you said it. It's, that there is always some sort of power play as soon as there are at least two people. But well, no. If you have the people who are playing with the toys that they have there, yeah, okay, yeah, it's sociology is all about the framing society, but yeah, it's. I still think that it's a point taken, but I still think that it's there might be other frameworks to arrange things that are always trying to read for the where is the power dynamic in that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do agree. I do agree that there are other frameworks. I don't. Far be it from me to say that this is the only possible framework or even the best framework. I just think that it is a framework. So it is one possible framework and not the best framework. It is the framework that appeals to me the most for a lot of personal reasons. And so when I made this proposal to the organization of LAMchester, it was with this framework in specific that I had in mind. That's also why I want to invite people to submit their own readings and their own texts. So instead of me just imposing my own framework on the whole thing, my idea is, cool, okay, so let's have you or someone else bring up a text that does that sort of analysis from another perspective altogether, and let's grab that text, let's share that text with everyone, let's read that text, and let's discuss that text. So I'm fully open for that. I mean, I think, and this might just be my own arrogance, I think I am paranoid enough to be able to find a power analysis framework in anything you might come up with. But again, that does not mean that it is the best framework or the only framework. It just means that it is one possible framework and not necessarily the best. And I think that frameworks need to fit the objective. So if you're trying to understand why people enjoy sensation play, then a power dynamics framework might not be the best framework to do it at all. Like, I totally agree with that. That does not mean that there isn't any incumbent power dynamics there from a macro, not a micro-social, so not a personal or interpersonal point of view, a macro-social power perspective. And that's what I was trying to get at with the purchasing power example, is that you can look at it from, a bit more separately and not so from a more psychological point of view. Now, one of the reasons why I like to do this is because if you open up most YouTube videos, news pieces, etc., on BDSM, you will have psychologists commenting on them the whole fucking time. And I have to work with psychologists the whole fucking time. It's really fun. But sometimes I also like to take a step back and, okay, let's look at this historically. Let's look at this with 3 or 4 centuries of framing rather than just a specific thing, which doesn't mean at all that it's better or worse, just a different approach to it. But I very much welcome any contributions that you have to make in terms of bringing up more text and different sorts of text if you want to.
Are you taking the entire conversation you've been having? Are you basically talking about the Pareto distribution?
The what, sorry?
Pareto distribution.
No, I'm not, because well, you might want to explain what that is to people who might not know. Sorry, because
I thought you were talking about sociology. I assume you would have. You would have the reference what I'm talking about.
no, I know, but other people might not. So it might be interesting to let other people know.
How do I explain this? Like basic rule of distribution, like this distribution of power that you can apply as much as sociology as biology, like into plants, like how, for example, trees compete for sunlight.
Yeah.
You can apply this to the atomic level, or just as much to the gravity and how planet forms. So, like, yeah, basically this distribution of how do I say it? How do I frame this? How things set themselves up. I had a good visual of it, of basically some kind of what would you imagine as a pachinko game.
Yeah.
Like the ball falling, and there's always more or less a setup, a pyramidal setup.
Yeah.
And it's what it talks about, and it's almost like a rule of nature that can apply to so many domains. It's like,
Yeah, so my approach, and again, I'm not saying that my approach is better than or worse than, just framing myself and introducing myself. My approach looks at power distributions less so in that hierarchical, organized pyramid scheme way, and more so in, do you know what a rhizome is? So a rhizome is a structure that doesn't have a fixed center. So it just branches off, like say some fungal constructions, for instance, are rhizomatic in the sense that they don't have a center. You don't have like a stem and then the roots. You have a center that can sort of evolve into something else and just branch off without a center. If you think about a computer network doesn't have one center. It has multiple branches, and if you cut off one part of the network, it just roots around it and goes on, carries on. Whereas if I cut your head off, you're kind of dead. You know, we are very much not rhizomatic, because, you know, you cut a few pieces off it. And so I think of power in that sense. It's less so of a hierarchical distribution, and it's more so sort of a network spread, a map spread. And have you ever seen a city at night from an airplane lighted up? So that's sort of the aspect of a rhizome. And if you look at a city lighted up from an airplane, you see that some places have more light, other places have less light. And so some power dynamics and circulations are stronger, others are thinner. Some are more central, some are more peripheric, etc., etc. So that's the kind of metaphor that I use when I'm talking about power.
Good metaphor. I'll think on that. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, there's a very famous, not a quote. I'm gonna alliterate a bit, but my favorite thinker in terms of power and defining power is Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, French post-structuralist philosopher from the 60s, 70s, 80s of the 20th century. And so I'm a big Michel Foucault fan, and anyone who has ever heard of him can sense it in the way I speak. But basically what he uses, I mean, he has he has a definition of power, which is 4 pages long, and that I will not repeat here. But basically what he says is that power is not something you can hold, and power is not something you can give. Power is something that only exists in the interaction. So I don't have power and I don't give power. We interact through power. And so it's a dynamic, it's a living thing, it's an organism, so to speak. It lives through the interaction, and if the interaction doesn't exist, then there's no power. And I think a really simple way of explaining that, imagine you have the richest person on the planet, okay? And then you kill everyone else. What good is that richness going to do that person? No. Doesn't matter. You can have a ton of gold, but there's no one else alive on the planet. What are you going to do with it? Nothing. Because there's no interaction, and therefore there's no exercise of power. So that's sort of how I think. Again, I'm not saying this is the best way, I'm just saying that this is the way I used to think about these things. Still have like 10 minutes or so. Does anyone? Okay, so then 2 things or 3 things that I'd like to ask you. Thing number 1, if you've enjoyed this or if you thought this was interesting, please come to the next one next month to at least see how it's actually going to happen, because this is just the introduction. And tell your friends about it. Tell your enemies about it. If you want to torture them, go watch this thing, it's really interesting. And then they'll be, oh, it's so boring. So there you go. You can also torture someone, you know, doing a DS, you know, now you have to watch that guy speak. It's perfect. It's perfect as far as torture goes, without any pain involved, unless it's a little pain. Also, if you plan on coming, or if you plan on planning on coming, all of these texts that I've mentioned, they're already online. You already have the link for them. So you can just go, if you're on FetLife, you can just go on the LAMchester group, Facebook group, and there will be a post for the reading group, and you have all of the texts that I've mentioned listed there with a link that's active. You can just click on them and you get the text. And then you can meet us, we can all meet next month and start discussing the first text. They're all in order, etc., etc. Third thing that I wanted to ask is, if you have reading suggestions that you'd like to make, please send them over to me. I will be very, very, very happy to integrate them into the reading group. And if you want to, we can actually sort of swap places, and you can be the organizers for the session that we're going to be discussing that text in, so as to, you know, prevent me from taking over or whatever, so you can have sort of some autonomy to present that text in the way that you think is best for the audience and for the content that you're proposing. And as Bugs Bunny used to say, that's all, folks. Thank you. See you next time.